started in 1972 with a couple of small projects, one in West Bengal and one in Karnataka, helping children out of school and children who were not able to access food. So it was very much children in really difficult circumstances. But that's about 50 years ago. So today, going from there, we are an organization which is spread across 24 states and a couple of union territories, working on several developmental agendas. As I said, quite a multi-development, multi-objective focus, working through what we call our state office, but they are really implementation nodes. So these are 14 implementation nodes spread in 14 states and serving another 12, so 26 in all. With both community level, sort of implementation as we call it, but also these serve as research and training hubs. ActionAid is one organization which has over the decades continued to work closely with communities, with their own small organizations, social formations, youth groups, women's groups, groups of children as well. On the one hand, with other social organizations such as smaller local organizations, what you would call NGOs. Often we work directly on the one hand, and then on the other with respective governments at the district and state level, nationally as well. And then with our supporters. Now our supporters include both individual supporters who continue to support us month-on-month basis, who believe in the task we are doing. There are institutional supporters with long-term institutional partnerships with ActionAid of the bilateral variety, the multilateral variety, but also increasingly corporate formations, what is called corporate social responsibility, corporate organizations. And in many, many instances, local governments, state governments in particular, but we've had over the decades support from central government for particular projects. Now, this all together goes into our mission of advancing social and ecological justice for everybody. We ensure that poorest and marginalized have access to legal and constitutional rights in several arenas, food and livelihoods, shelter, education, healthcare, dignity, and then that they have a voice in decision making. They bring their voice into that input into what policies are being formulated for them. We've been responding actively, and over these years, over the last 3 decades in particular, to emergency situations, major emergencies, smaller ones, earthquakes, floods, cyclones, other disasters, and providing humanitarian support to very, very vulnerable communities. Now, this happens both in the shape of relief and also in the shape of reconstruction and long-term rehabilitation. So, in a nutshell, that is what ActionAid that is what would symbolize ActionAid. Ye Kahani Badalni, as the name symbolizes, is symbolic of how many stories and what narratives need to be changed. Coming back to the specifics, rights of girl children is something that ActionAid have been advancing and has been central to our efforts since we launched our Beti Zindabad campaign. Now that is about 8 years ago. It predates the national campaign, which then in 2014 the Prime Minister of India launched about the girl children. So in fact, this campaign of ours is more towards focusing social attention, policy attention as well, to this discrimination and oppression that girls face and have faced over centuries, girls and women. And that can very well be seen in the declining sex ratio then. So that's how we launched this campaign. And this campaign sought to sort of celebrate daughters, change the mindsets of people in communities against son preference, and against all forms of discrimination that girls and women face. Ye Kahani Badalni is a specific initiative or episode, if I may say, a more recent one that you mentioned, which is around eradicating gender-based discrimination and practices. Now, this is focused on 2 specific districts of 2 states, Rajasthan and Uttar Pradesh. So it's the Karoli district of Rajasthan, and it is the Muzaffarnagar district in Uttar Pradesh, where with support from United Nations UNFPA agency, as well as in partnership with local formations, Astitva Samajik Seva Sansthan in Uttar Pradesh in Muzaffarnagar, and Alwar Mewat Institute of Educational Development, a long-term partner in Rajasthan. These are very two grounded organizations. So together in this constellation, we are now focusing on these two districts which report very low child sex ratio. There's a major gap in gender gap in literacy and widespread early child marriages. So we together selected about 400 villages across these districts with the purpose of actually bringing about a change in how the social construct of gender is. And obviously, needless to say, this is a long-term effort. Now, here in these two districts, we have identified about 1,000 young volunteers, women and men, who are trained and capacitated as social change agents. And these 1,000 people work together with panchayat leaders, work together with families, work together with the local administration and other village frontline workers. They are actually working at the interface of behavioral change within these communities. Over the last 1 year now, in fact, a little more than that, in an effort to bring about a change in the norms of how girl children are looked at or how girls are looked at. And this is a progress in making. But let me give you some examples. In Rajasthan, you may have heard of Akha Teej. So around the festival of Akha Teej, which falls in early spring, it's in April, here a range of child marriages happen. It is believed that that's a good time. And that's the time when a lot of young girls, children in fact, are married off. So within 1 year of our intervention, at least in Karoli district, so I won't generalize it across Rajasthan, but within that particular month, a lot of child marriages happen. So within 1 year of this project, we have been able to dissuade in 400 villages, communities from stopping this practice. In fact, to tell you specifically, in the 400 villages that this project operates, roughly about 379 villages are now reporting some kind of a celebration at the moment of birth of girls. And it's a big change from what used to happen, where the birth of boys is obviously celebrated and was celebrated and continues to be celebrated and should be celebrated. But equally well, the birth of girls is also now being celebrated, which used to be sometimes a moment for mourning in these villages. Uh, Many of these villages are reporting shift in the way the household chores are distributed. And based on this, we are now thinking of building up a national campaign on sharing of work. But at least in about 300, 296 to be precise, where we we're sort of monitoring data on this. 296 of these 400 villages across these two states, across these two districts, are now reporting a shift in household patterns of work distribution. And boys and men are coming forward and sharing a little bit more work than they have been in the past. And we hope this is now an equal share in the coming years. Domestic violence reports have gone down in 223 of those villages where we are monitoring. Alcoholism is reportedly contained, considerable decline actually in alcoholism in at least about 200 of the 400 villages that we are working on. Now, these are some of the indicators which, very small indicators, one may say at one level, but very significant indicators at another level, which are going to show what kind of societal and behavioral shifts are happening, and eventually structural shifts. Of course, we would like to see this century as a century where women are finally empowered. It has been an unfulfilled promise of history, and I think a social shift is in order in this century. And to this extent, we plan to extend this idea of changing the narrative, changing the story, changing the history, and in fact, the story of the history of exploitation of women. And I think if there's one time where we see hope, it is in this century, where finally women and men would by the end of the century, we hope, be on a completely equal space, equal share, equal footing, if not sooner than the end of this century. We hope, of course, it's a sooner one. And that's the big gap we are trying to address through this idea of ye kahani badalni. It's a specific episode, it's a specific instance of a general work or a general campaign that we have with an idea of seeking equality for women and men. Yes, it is true. There are two or three issues here. First, let me say that the way we sort of started this was actually to talk to panchayats. So in the first instance, it's a co-ownership model that these projects run on. So it's not an outside agency or an outside social organization going into those villages and holding forth wisdom and knowledge. But there is a range of behavioral and training practices that we adopted with the panchayat members and the panchayat leaders, seeking their help to identify these young volunteers that I was speaking of. So in fact, young women and men from these villages were identified by the village communities themselves as people who would hold out a particular promise, young people who have the fire, quote unquote, the fire in the belly. So that's the way we have gone. Now, these young volunteers, 1,000 of them in both these districts taken together, were then trained into how to work in group situations, what kind of focus group discussions to inspire and to enable, how to approach the issue, particularly with elders, with different groups within of the communities, religious groups. For example, in Karoli district, with different with groups of women, with groups of men, with religious groups, both Muslims and Hindus. So how to go ahead and do that? How to sort of talk with the existing power structures within villages? How to talk with boys and girls separately and together? How to talk to school children? How to take their energies and their ideas into, so it's in short, it's a participatory process, co-owned, collectively designed, with skills and techniques from the end of social organizations such as ourselves, in terms of processes, in terms of activities to do. So we employed a range of methodologies, from drawings to paintings to posters to conversations, to actually what is called problem analysis, in terms of how do you trace the root causes of discrimination. So that helped us overcome what you just called as somewhat a resistance, um, uh, and it's not that it's gone overnight. So it's not that change happens overnight. So that the data I was sharing with you, or the indicators I was sharing with you, are indicators in progress, and it's not a one-time resistance. So one has to be prepared for an ongoing resistance. I mean, suppose we were tomorrow to take up, and we plan to, in years to come, in times to come, or in months to come, the question of property rights. So when you get into that aspect, one can imagine, and one has faced in other situations, considerable resistance when you start to make a shift, with a call that men and women must have equal share in land rights, or in other forms of property, and that women must co-own the property and the decision making around it. So at every particular level, social resistance of years of patriarchal practices, I mean, social resistance which comes from years of patriarchal practice, belief in patriarchy, needs to be smashed. And that takes time, that takes effort, that takes, what one would say, staying capacity. And we believe that young people, and therefore we've identified young volunteers. We believe that young people have what it takes to bring almost a new world order, a new social order, with reference to challenging and smashing patriarchy. And I think that's one of the beliefs that we have, and that belief holds out in what's happening in the villages that I was talking of. We have for long sort of worked on ensuring that out of school children and children who we call in difficult circumstances on account of various reasons, are back to school. we generally operate with the belief that any child out of school is almost like a child labor, or vulnerable to being a child labor. So one of our ongoing efforts was some time now, quite some time now, is to get out of school children back to school. This on the one hand. And on the other hand, it is a question of ensuring that uh, public we believe in public education, and our efforts go on to strengthening public education. So it's more meaningful, curriculum is better, children are there. It has we have a model of what on 14 points on what a good public education could be and what it does it mean for the schools. So in the context of COVID, this created a huge problem. And needless to say, the access, there's differential access to education, uh, and access of children to schools were closed to begin with. But even when it moved to online, in many cases, still hasn't. Uh, Children's education and schooling was affected considerably, and this has a lot of social repercussions. I mentioned to you about, indicated to you about child marriage. So obviously, that this means that given also the other forms of precarity which we were just speaking about, and given the fact that schools are closed, it can mean a much greater risk for girls in particular, and obviously for communities which have been outside of education. So with both those, and of course, the third aspect is lockdowns have meant that women's work burdens have really gone up. So within that context, we have been working tirelessly for some time, yeah, for about 4 months or even slightly around that, with an effort to get children to continue their education. And now, this again through two ways. One, where there is an online access issue, our volunteers are with children to ensure a meaningful use of wherever there is an online teaching going on. And wherever schools have been closed, our volunteers have actually been helping children through special patshalas, through helping them in teaching. Uh, to give you an example, uh, in Uttar Pradesh, our education, and now this was going on, by the way, and then COVID meant that we had to change our strategies, like you rightly said. Like in Uttar Pradesh, our education volunteers, now all these education, we have 5,300 education volunteers in the state of Uttar Pradesh alone. I'm giving you an example of one state in the time there is. And they are these volunteers from 20 districts in Uttar Pradesh are based in the village themselves. And so our volunteers during COVID times sought out those children who were having much difficulty in terms of accessing education, in terms of continuing school, in terms of the school closures, and the fact that they were having continuous, significant difficulties in even learning. So as of 30th June, we were able to reach to about 50,000 children, around half of them girls, across 4,500 villages, in terms of ensuring their continuity of education. Uh, this is something that data for June tells me. Now this is Jan to June data, but if I were to look at specifically at COVID pandemic times and all these months of COVID pandemic alone, then about 2,000 of our education volunteers stepped forward in this particular state of Uttar Pradesh to ensure continuity of education of children from vulnerable communities, children of daily wagers, migrant workers. Now, these volunteers, on the one hand, have been motivating parents of these children to ensure their continued education. But besides, they've been giving free tuitions to out of school children to help them continue their teaching, their interest in education, to help them continue with the reading, writing, and arithmetic, and to ensure they reach parity with other children of their age when they do get admission into age appropriate classes later on. Um, we've been running in another state in Haryana, in specific areas with vulnerable communities, Mohalla Pathshalas. Once again, village-based volunteers are running these Mohalla Pathshalas. On the 8th of September this year, we've launched a Yes to School campaign with an idea of advancing these very ideas of identifying volunteers, training volunteers, what we call our Shiksha Sathis, our volunteers, across 15 states, with the main objective to ensure free, quality, and inclusive education to all children during these times. So that is how we are doing. One of the things that the volunteers do is they work very closely with the school management committees, strengthen the school management committees uh, to have far more insightful discussions, regular discussions on all school related issues. At this point in time, on online education issues as well. At this point in time, on parallel classes or special classes. Uh, in addition, we have been running, at least in states of Haryana and Uttar Pradesh for now, and we are planning to sort of generalize it across different states. A campaign which we call Act for Scholarship. We're trying to link up through various Janta ka webinars, face-to-face trainings, once again with volunteers, children who are supposed to get scholarships, children from Dalit, tribal, and backward communities and minorities who are supposed to, who could get what is called school scholarship under the government schemes, but have neither the information about it nor the awareness about it. And even if they have the information and awareness about it, have not filled up the form for one reason or other. So we're running this campaign called the Act for Scholarship to help link these children with the various scholarship schemes of the center and the state, which are slightly, in addition to each other. And we've trained volunteers to have these interactive discussions with students for the processes of filling up scholarship applications, facilitating application filing processes, facilitating linkages with the block education officials and other officials responsible for scholarship schemes or link persons for scholarship schemes at the district level. In Uttar Pradesh alone, for instance, we reached out to 16,108 children and supported nearly 6,000 children in filling up applications for various scholarships in 28 districts. I don't have the offhand figure for Haryana, but it's something quite considerable as well. Uh, we've been running a lot of webinars, and these webinars are not, sort of restricted to what's called urban kind of webinars. We run what's called a Janta Ka webinar series, जहाँ पे where our volunteers are able to go and sit with children, their abhivavaks, meaning their parents, and other school management committees in the village with one mobile instrument. And in these webinars, it's like a training program on how do you fill your scholarship schemes, what kind of scholarship schemes are there. One of the last webinars I was on personally, we had the officials from the social welfare ministry actually telling us and training young students and volunteers on how to fill out these forms, what kind of schemes are available in different states of the country. So that's also been going on. That's with reference to our Act for Scholarship campaign. In 50 districts in 5 states of the country, uh, together with support from UNICEF, we have our district level staff who are focusing on preventing child marriages with an ultimate goal of linking girls to education, preventing trafficking. So our district staff, who we call district coordinators, are based in the districts, 50 districts, and they work closely with district administration on the one hand, and with volunteers, as I was mentioning you, on the other hand, with local community formations, local social organizations, in ensuring that no girls are married before the age, and girls are linked to education. And that's had considerable success till now. This has been a campaign which has been, there's been effort, it's more than a campaign, which has been going on for the last, let me say, about a year or so, a year and a half. In all, one data tells me that we've managed to stop actually So we managed to support 1,771 girls, and we managed to support 1,771 child marriages in these 5 states, from where these girls were fixed to get married, and we managed to stop it. And this is an ongoing effort in states of Bihar, Jharkhand, Odisha, Rajasthan, and West Bengal. Everybody faced a lot of economic hardships, and it continues. It has been hugely disruptive. There has been rise in poverty levels. One almost can say in instances that COVID would probably undo 3 decades of progress. In fact, we are doing on another matter. We're doing time-based surveys with informal workers of India. We did the first round quite early into COVID in the month of May and June, which covered nearly 11,000 workers across 20 states. And we looked at a number of indicators, economic primarily, in terms of their job loss, in terms of their nutrition levels, in terms of their income losses, in terms of the status of their entitlements and linkage with various government announcements of the time. And then we followed it up with a second round, which is just concluded last month. Now, this time on a sample of 16,900 workers from 22 states of the country, on the similar indicators with added indicators of return, migration, and so on and so forth. And we will do the third round early next year, if we started this end of this year. So the idea is to look at the same set of workers over a period of 1 year, and look at how they're coping with the situation, and what is the status of their linkage with various sort of either special COVID schemes or ongoing entitlements that they have. And now these informal workers, as you can imagine, are constituted by people who are also socially and historically deprived. I mean, that is what the state is. And that a majority of informal workers come from Dalit communities, come from tribal communities, come from other backward castes, or are religious minorities. There's an intersectionality of precarity here. So this is the migrant workers I was speaking of. So that's one data that we see. The other data that we see comes across from our ongoing work with particularly vulnerable tribal groups. For the last 40 years or so, ActionAid Association India has been, sort of working very, very closely with what used to be called primitive tribal groups, renamed as particularly vulnerable tribal groups around 2 decades ago. Numerically very small, very disempowered, almost on a extreme precarity of existence. That's how they are typified. Now, this we've been doing this developmental interventions in about 5 states for the last 35 years with some progress. So the other experience comes from there of partnering with particularly vulnerable tribal communities. For the last 2 decades, additionally with the denotified tribes of India, what used to be the ex-criminal tribes, and the pastoral and semi-pastoral communities of India. So based on this, we also had undertaken a special study of PVTGs and the impact of COVID on particularly vulnerable tribal communities. I think that was done in the month of May, June. And there we talked to, because it was lockdown months, and it was not possible for our volunteers and our teams to go face to face, hold village to village yatras. I mean, in the past, a lot of our studies with PVTGs have involved the methodology of walking to villages, being with them, discussing with them, and then arriving at findings. But this time around, it was more sort of phone based, or some of our volunteers who could get there with the respondents. So we contacted about 500 such members from PVTG communities across 3 states. So basis that lockdown, we found that lockdown had impacted substantively the economic, and had added substantive precarities to the lives of particularly vulnerable tribal groups. These are the months, March, April, May, are the months of collection of minor forest produce. And one of the things we noted, and they told us, I mean, this is not just an ActionAid analysis. It's verbatim the views of communities, that lockdown affected them because the storage. PVTGs, when the minor forest produce is collected, you need storage space, and that storage space has always been in shortfall. It's not COVID related. But the fact that lockdown happened, they couldn't sell their produce immediately into the markets. And if you don't have sufficient storage capacity, it wastes. So there's a considerable loss of income reported on account of, although basis of many of these findings and small efforts at the state level, some of the state governments did allow sale of the minor forest produce. But needless to say, by the time now it gets done, people have already lost a lot of incomes. And this is particularly hard when you're already at an extreme level of precarity, and lives of particularly vulnerable tribal communities are always at that existential precarious level, given all the land grabs that have happened, given all the other changes, climatic changes that have happened. So that's something we noted. Many among the denotified tribes, for example, and this is something they shared with us again, people who are in performing, nuts, for instance, they depend on movement and performances, which were completely closed. And many of these communities, one must also remember, particularly the denotified tribes, are not already linked to the welfare schemes. So there probably many of them won't have ration cards given their nomadic status, and they don't have. So they escape all the benefits of whatever special announcements were made. For instance, the Delhi government now announced that they would give cash to all of the construction workers who were registered. But the fact that DNTs are far cry from any form of registration, so they're not going to get anything. So I think that these are things that our study has noted. Now, in terms of what we've been doing, so given our relationships and given our existing work with tribal communities, particularly vulnerable tribal communities, and in many instances with denotified tribes, I mean, one can't say everyone is covered, but given those relationships in those states, we were able to reach out relief and succor to them. In total, ActionAid, which support a lot of people, a lot of corporates, for instance. I'm really in gratitude for that. We were able to reach out in these months to roughly about 77 lakh people by the way of relief support, and this across the country. And we use a part of that support to reach out to particularly vulnerable tribal communities for the food support that they needed, ration supplies, some amount of
Basic
sanitation
necessities.
material, in addition to awareness stuff.
Right.
Awareness about hand washing, and the challenge of water is always there, but the education about how COVID spreads, the use of masks, awareness about other sanitation. But more than that, actually food support, either, and in this instance, usually dry ration support. We are part of that challenge. We are part of trying to work on that challenge of generating sustainable livelihood options. Now, MGNREGA, or Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Program, offers one such avenue, but it needs to go beyond. Basis of a grounded inputs into policy formulation is exactly that. That yes, let's enhance NREGA, MGNREGA, let's enhance the number of days, let's enhance the registration, let's ensure that every adult member has a job card under MGNREGA. So that's one part of the story. And the other part of the story is let's enhance other forms of rural enterprise and livelihoods, on farm and off farm, both, and create those opportunities through what could be called panchayat level livelihood planning. And what did we do about it? That basis of these inputs, we were invited actually to the National Human Rights Commission's expert committee on giving recommendations of what would then constitute as advisories by the NHRC to the central and state governments. So in our drafting of the advisory, which we were invited as an expert group member, we brought in all these inputs in terms of livelihoods, in particular for informal workers of India, including the migrant workers of India, of which these two groups are an instance. So we were able to bring in all of these micro inputs, basis of our numerous studies. We did another study on the impact of COVID-like lockdown on pastoral communities of India. And that was done in partnership with an organization called Marak in Gujarat, which works primarily with Rabadis and other nomadic pastoralists in the state of Gujarat. So together with them in Gujarat, but with other formations and our own direct work with nomadic pastoralists, we likewise looked at about 500 pastoral communities members, asking them what are the challenges and what would they advise. So a range of such studies with domestic workers, with nomadic pastoralists, with particularly vulnerable tribal groups, with general migrant informal workers. 16,900 is the example I gave you. Basis of what women said at the quarantine center. So we had another study with from the perspective of women who were at the quarantine centers and how they looked at the quarantine centers. So we were able to bring in a lot of these very grounded inputs into our recommendations to the National Human Rights Commission, which then the National Human Rights Commission issued as advisory to the center and state governments. We are able to now do so on an ongoing basis. We are doing so on the the Ministry of Labor has recently opened up for consultation. So this is how these studies help. Now, this apart from what we do in our development work of reaching out succor, of partnering, of developing sustainable livelihoods. In several instances, these are around collective agricultures. We work with women's groups, if I may generalize it, this around about 600 such collectives of women, range from 15 to 20 each. I mean, this is not directed from here, from ActionAid, but it's basis of women's own choices, who collectivize into agriculture, who come together as groups, share their land, not legally, but pool in their land for the purpose of agriculture, produce together, save labor. It's a labor saving and sharing device both. It's a risk mitigation device process, and it's also an empowerment process. So those are the kind of things one does on an ongoing basis, both within of the tribal context, but without the tribal context as well. Lockdown, we heard it's an interesting one there. You see, we heard a lot of talk about how suddenly nature is at its best, and how suddenly it's much clearer and the grass much greener, and economy was at a complete standstill, and human activity at its lowest. It almost looked like what the world would be if there was no human activity. So I saw visuals of some cities. I don't know if they were fabricated, but I saw some visuals of some cities with animals that weren't supposed to be part of those spaces there. In any case, so it's in this context that my colleagues decided to look at what's happening to rivers. See, this follows our focus on the question of water. I mentioned to you about disasters and emergencies. What I did not mention to you is a considerable part of disasters and emergencies are what is called man-made, and the destruction that's been happening. I mentioned to you about our mission around and our quest around ecological justice at the interface of social justice. So in this context, we've been for the past few years trying to make an effort with communities most impacted, and this we call Act for Water. It's a campaign on water, And this also follows the national announcement and the focus on the question of water, both in terms of availability, both in terms of its quality, but also in terms of its scarcity, and also in terms of how we interact with nature, and how we interact with commons. For us, water is one of the great commons of humankind, which we all must protect and defend, and it's vanishing, and its quality is eroded, and a lot of majorities of our country have not the access to water. So it's in that context that we now decided to look at what the rivers were. Some years ago, we'd done a very interesting study, which was later used by officials of CAG office, Comptroller and Auditor General's office, to train their own officials on the question of stolen sand and on the issues of sand mining in India. So following all that, this time around during lockdown times and the restrictions of lockdown, on methodology, there's a lot of lockdown restrictions on how you do your study as well. So in any case, within those restrictions, we did a quick study to look at this question of what happened to rivers during this lockdown time. So sometime in June, July, we've looked at 10 rivers of this country, and we've talked to 550 or so respondents of riverine communities to ask them what was their perception, because these are river dependent communities and members of river dependent communities. And what they told us, the study has far more details than what I can articulate in the next couple of minutes. But what they told us, the quality of water had become better in their perception. So they were able to use river water much more than they were using it before, for domestic purposes, even if not for cooking, for washing, for bathing. Yeah. What they told us is the quantum of fish or the type of fish, in their perception, of course, this is not a scientific rigorous methodology, has gone up. Thirdly, what they told us is that they were able to use river water more for agricultural purposes. Apart from the fact that rivers appear cleaner and bluer and less polluted. Formation, I mean, like a human child has to learn to walk, has to learn to talk. I'm sure our organization went through that. I wasn't part of it then. But this is not about me. I mean, in the annals of our history, certainly those difficulties have been there. And it is a memory of history for us, and something we would like to value. Gives us courage of conviction as well. But I think as of now, let me put it. We don't face great difficulties, given the kind of sort of spread we have, the grounded nature of relationships we have with social formations, with people's own organization, with communities group. It gives us a lot of moral courage, support, togetherness, solidarity, and fundamentally great strength. So in that regard, even financial challenges we don't, because there's a microcosm of that support. ActionAid Association is one of the early organizations in this country. Back in 1998, we'd set up the corporate social responsibility law wasn't there. We'd set up our efforts to engage the corporate sector in a corporate accountability and responsibility framework. And we'd even set up an organization called Partners in Change to exclusively work with company managements, corporate managements. Our strategy of the year 1995, I was part of it. It recognized that there were about 300 million middle classes at that point in time. I'm talking of 1995. I still remember the figures, and that we said that this is an India which is growing, and this is a middle class which is growing, which has gone several fold from that 300 million of 1995, estimated in 1995. And it is in that year 1996-97, that we set up our idea of working with the corporate sector, working with that emerging middle class of India, uh, uh, conscientizing them, engaging them in solidarity for the cause of the masses of this country. Some causes are very difficult for middle classes to align with, but many causes are not so difficult for middle classes to align with. For instance, COVID brought out a lot of support from the middle classes onto the question of workers, which probably wouldn't have been so
Right.
visible in an earlier time. So that's what ActionAid did in the 90s, late 90s. So the Partners in Change was set out as a separate by now registered as a separate organization, which focuses on the corporate sector. We've had a CSR policy or an engagement policy with corporates for a long time now. So that's what I was trying to share with you. More recently, let me give you an instance. I was telling you that we reached out with a range of food support
Yeah.
to, to lakhs of people, 77 approximately to
Yeah.
our count across the states, and a lot of it. Let me put it that about 70 to 75% of it comes from a range of corporate supporters. So it's not just one company or another company; it's a range of companies, big, small, public sector, private sector, and that gives you hope and faith in terms of the spirit in of partnerships that we. So let me put it in the positive. Of course, there are challenges.
Mm.
We still hope that many of these social justice quests. I was giving you the example of "Ye Kahani Badalni Hai."
Right.
The gender justice, for instance,
Mm.
women's property rights, for instance,
Mm.
rights of workers, for instance, yeah, social protection for informal workers, for instance. We are hoping and we are appealing using your medium to the corporate formations and who supported us and have been supporting us and we have been critically engaging with them critically and constructively.
Mm.
We are hoping that that support will be forthcoming in a greater measure because that's the growing part of India. Yeah?
Yeah.
And there is a large part of India and also growing, by the way,
Mhm.
because of the rise of inequality over these years across in India and globally. Is growing precarity of majorities of our country. So we are hoping that in that quest of social and ecological justice, the corporate formations will join us. And uh, the one other challenge we will considerably face, will always face. We are a large country, so how much do individuals? We are seeking support from individuals, whatever little, 100 rupees or a 200 rupees or a 700 rupees in this quest. So it's not just the money, yeah, to which we are all accountable and we will be accountable. We
Yes.
pride ourselves in our accountability or try best levels of accountability. But in whatever levels, they are able to bring solidarity to that purpose.
Mm.
For the quest for an equal India, um, for the quest for a just India, which I think is all of us in this country, yeah, dream of, yeah, means more than financial support. It does mean them to come and support financially whoever they want, directly, social organizations, other instruments. There are several instruments to change, of which we are one. Uh,
Mm.
but also more than just financial support. Yeah, it's more than just economic redistribution. It's also the solidarity. It's also that will to bring about change. The biggest question for us is how much in the next decade we are able to reach out in a very grounded manner, work together with the most vulnerable members of our society. Yeah? The communities, vulnerable communities, vulnerable groups, individual members in our society in the remotest corners of India. And we look forward to that with some courage and hope. So that's what I want to say. I want to also say that in our thinking going ahead, we pin a lot of hope uh, in the young people, young women and men, the children and youth of today, yeah, both in rural and urban spaces, to be the flag bearers and to be, if I may use the word vanguard, to be the leaders of this change. And I was mentioning to you that we are extremely honored to work with young volunteers, around 10,000 or so across the country, who are young people who believe in change, who are committed in change, who volunteer their time and go ahead and make that change happen. So I think that's one of the ways going ahead. So that's the way we want to see the future journey